Thank you very much, Jessica. Well, welcome to the debate here on France 24. 15 months after Hosni Mubarak's fall, the second act of Egypt's revolution is underway. Millions of Egyptians choosing a president in what's being billed as the first free elections in the country's 5,000-year history. That's right, 5,000 years. Now, 52 million out of the country's 80 million are eligible to cast a ballot in the Arab world's most populous country. 13 candidates, now that's down from an original 23, are in the running. A couple of them have sort of pulled off the ballot, but it's officially 13. Now, as polls opened on Wednesday, as you can see, voters lined up outside many of the country's 13,000 polling stations. Now, if as expected, we have no outright winner emerging from this first two-day round, we'll be having a runoff vote, and that will be held in mid-June. Now, the outcome, of course, could set Egypt's course for decades to come. It will also determine the role of Islamist versus secular values in political life and society. Now, what course will Egyptians choose? Will the president have even a fighting chance of healing divisions while tackling poverty, fighting violent and soaring crime? Now, my guests today are going to try to answer some of those very difficult questions. Here in the studio with me, to my left is Shahir Rigaud. Thanks for joining us. You are a member of the Association of Copts in France. For our viewers, the Copts are the largest Christian community in Egypt, about 10% of the population.
Exactly. Coptic Solidarity Association.
Coptic Solidarity. And also with me, Bernard Haeckel, welcome. You are a professor of Near Eastern Studies at Princeton University in the United States, and you have a broad overview of the entire region. And via satellite tonight from Washington, D.C., we have Eric Traeger. He's a fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. And finally, by phone from Cairo, we have Nader Amran. He's a member of the Muslim Brotherhood's Freedom and Justice Party, and the party is the point man. He's the party's point man on foreign policy. Now, before beginning the debate, I'd like to just take a quick look for our viewers at some of the presidential hopefuls. There are a few, 4 or 5 plausible contenders, people are saying. Among them, Amr Moussa, a former foreign minister under Mubarak, who more recently served, you may know him as the Secretary General of the Arab League. He sees himself as a liberal who will fight for social justice. Number 2 on our list, Mohammed Mursi. He's the Muslim Brotherhood's second choice candidate. Second choice because he had to replace the original pick after that man was disqualified. Now, Mursi's seen largely lacking charisma by many people, but has the backing of a powerful party machine. And I may mention he also supports Sharia law as the basis of an Egyptian constitution, yet to be drafted constitution. And number 3, Abdul Monem Abul Fotu, long name, but a very prominent, important candidate, former Muslim Brotherhood member, former because he was suspended by his own party after announcing he was running for president last year. Now, he has the support of both liberals and young revolutionaries and the ultra-conservative Salafists, drawing a large umbrella over himself. And finally, 4th plausible contender, Ahmed Shafiq. He's known as the army guy, as a former general, the army's choice. He was Egypt's last prime minister under Hosni Mubarak, forced to step down after Mubarak himself was ousted by the army. He is considered, like I said, the military's man. Now, we're going to go directly to Cairo to sort of get a sense of what's been going on there on this first day of the first round of voting. Correspondent in the region, Gallagher Fenwick's there. Gallagher, good evening. You've been out and about in Cairo today, sort of monitoring the voting. What name are you hearing? You just heard the candidates that we've sort of listed as the plausible contender. People you've been speaking to, any names sort of stand out there?
Well, not really, Douglas, and that's quite interesting. The outcome of this one is going to be very difficult to predict. As you mentioned, we went around Cairo today talking to voters in different neighborhoods. There were a lot of people, a lot of excitement, but quite a bit of concern as well. One woman, for instance, telling us that she was very happy to vote, but also describing the experience as taking a step into the unknown because Egyptians are electing a man whose powers are not yet clearly defined. Remember that the former constitution was dissolved. Another man was telling us about how proud he was of being amongst the very first Egyptians to freely elect their leader for their country after 7,000 years. So quite a bit of humor there, and certainly none of the tension that we previously experienced, for instance, when trying to film the army or the roadblocks that soldiers set up around Liberation Square, as it's been nicknamed. Another thing that we noticed is how polarized people are. And going back to your question, there are no reliable polls, as you know, but just going around and asking people who they're going to vote for, you get just about every answer. An Islamist candidate for some, a revolutionary for others, or a member of the former regime. You know, Egyptians call them falul. That Arabic word literally means leftovers. So it's very hard at this point to predict the outcome of the first round, but it also means that there will, as you mentioned, likely be a second round in 3 weeks. And I'd say that the big unknown as well, and that's something that you hear a lot from people, is whether after the second round, whether the army, which is still currently holding power, will allow for smooth transition, basically handing over the reins of the country to a democratically elected civilian government.
Gallagher, we're going to leave it there with you. Thanks for that sort of mood setter there from Cairo, and I want to now take it into the studio. You know, we're talking about these elections, and we're talking about, you know, voters choosing from 13 candidates. It's been a messy transition, and many people say it's a very messy election, and there's already people asking questions about the whole constitutionality of this vote. And whether or not it should have even happened now. A lot of people from the old Mubarak regime running. I'd like to start with you, Bernard Haeckel. Do you believe that these elections could be free and fair? Are they legitimate? Do you see them as legitimate?
I do. I mean, so far we haven't heard any negative reports about vote rigging. I see that a number of Westerners are there, you know, monitoring the elections. So I don't think that the constitutionality of this election will really be in any serious doubt. What is in doubt is, you know, what powers will this person have once elected, and presumably 3 weeks from now.
Eric Traeger in Washington there, if you can hear me. Do you agree with that basically that these elections are sort of on course? So far, so good, at least in, you know, given the sort of messy situations, wasn't going to be perfect in any scenario. What do you sort of make of it on this first day?
Well, the important point, thanks for having me, the important point is that the elections are happening. They're happening on time when the military promised to hold them. So I agree with Professor Haeckel on that. The truth is that we won't really know whether there's rigging or the extent of forgery until well after the fact. It's not really something that even people on the ground can see, because rigging could happen inside the polling place. It could happen when ballots are being transported. It could happen when they're being counted in large stadiums. So we really have no idea. The important question ultimately is whether Egyptians come to see these elections as legit. And my fear is that especially if the Muslim Brotherhood candidate does not win, the Brotherhood will declare that the SCAF, that's the military junta, rigged it, because since the Brotherhood announced it would nominate a candidate in late March, it has accused the military of trying to rig the elections. And I think that's really the question. How do Egyptians see these elections once the results are known?
And I just may note, there have been on this first day, some might say perhaps inevitably, given the size of Egypt, 80 million people, there have been reports of violations at several places, violations already, which have been reported to the High Election Commission. I'd like to sort of change our focus a little bit, talk about what a lot of people have been talking about, which is this showdown between Islamist forces and this more civic society forces, the liberals, the leftists, the young revolutionaries. Shahir Rigaud, let me ask you, you are, some would say, maybe seeing this from a slightly the minority perspective. You're a member of the Coptic community, 10% of Egyptians, largest Christian community in Egypt.
Yes.
I suppose that when you see the Islamists going up against these secular forces, you have a very specific, perhaps, take on this whole election. Who do you want to actually see victorious in this? Do you have a preference?
Yes, like everybody else, I have a preference. But my main concern with these elections is what could be the best possible choice for the Copts in Egypt today. I think this is a legitimate question. The answer is not very clear, because there are many possibilities, and the Copts among themselves have made different choices. They have not all chosen the same person.
Okay, no, obviously they're not voting as a bloc, but we were talking earlier about the person that we called the Army's preferred candidate, Ahmed Shafiq.
Yes, and he is not the preferred candidate of the Copts. He is one of them.
So there are other army-backed
yes, you have
Amr Moussa?
Amr Moussa for a certain profile of Copts. Age-wise, it would be the older generations. They would be looking for more stability, more economic growth. To have somebody in power with a certain background, politically speaking, and in this case, of course, Amr Moussa has all the conditions, even if he's considered among the fulul or the remnants, the leftovers of the old regime.
And he is a leftover.
But many young Copts were very, very active in wanting to vote for Hamdine Sabahi, who is the socialist candidate, very, very popular among the young generations, and with a Nasserist profile.
He's seen as Abdel Nasser, obviously, the revolutionary
Yes,
1952
he is seen
revolution.
as being the candidate of the revolution, at least the generation that carried out this revolution, and with the possibility of being anti-Islamist, or at least secular. To be on the safe side. A secular candidate.
A secular candidate, and there's sort of an assumption within that a secular candidate might be better able to ensure the security and the peace of mind of the Copts. We were talking before the show, Bernard Haeckel, and you disagree that the army might be the best guarantor of the Copt security.
I mean, I really think that, this clear distinction that's being drawn between secularists and Islamists doesn't hold. Like, for instance, with Abdul Munaim Abdul Futuh, he's a candidate who is an Islamist, clearly a former Muslim brother, but who has rallied to his side many liberals and many secularists. So you have in him someone who bridges a divide. The other thing that I want to underscore and underline here is that the army, in the last massacre of the Copts that happened earlier this year, played a very, very dirty role in fomenting through the press and the media and the radio station, TV station, a very aggressive counterattack against a peaceful demonstration of Copts.
So these are not peaceful people.
20-some people died. And so the Coptic card or the Coptic issue can be used by the army as it can be by Islamists to rally, the support of the base.
Eric Traeger, let me bring you back into this. There's an assumption, it might be fair to say, by many people, especially in the West, that there's something inherently dangerous about an Islamist candidate being elected president. And we mentioned at the outset, among those four plausible contenders, what we called them, two of them are from Islamist parties, a Muslim Brotherhood candidate and a former Muslim Brotherhood candidate. How do you size up the Islamist, I don't want to call it the threat, but the Islamist sort of influence over society if they were to win?
Well, I think what you have to remember is that Egypt is an extremely religious society. And, when I was in Cairo during the parliamentary elections and I would speak to people and ask them who they voted for and why, obviously most people said they voted for the Islamists, and they voted for them because they wanted to, quote, be ruled by our religion. And you hear that a lot. So it's not surprising that Islamists would do well. But as far as the threat, yes, absolutely. That is something that will create real difficulties, especially for the West, in dealing with this new Egypt, because both Islamist candidates hold extremely hostile views towards the West. Just for example, Abdul Munaim Abdul Futuh is endorsed by Al-Ghama al-Islamiyya and Omar Abdul Rahman. Al-Ghama al-Islamiyya is a terrorist organization, and Omar Abdul Rahman was convicted for his involvement in the 1993 World Trade Center bombing. I would suggest that the young people who endorsed Abdul Futuh, while not all Islamists, are not liberals, because liberals would not support someone who's a theocrat. Actually, it might be more accurate to say that they're anti-SCAF or anti-regime, but they're certainly not liberals. And I think that's really kind of the point I want to make in response to the comments that were made, that liberalism really isn't there. Liberals are not playing a role. None of the candidates are liberals. You're basically choosing in Egypt between Islamists on one hand and old regime members on the other, with Hamdine Sabahi being perhaps a very old regime type of candidate in that he's a Nasserist. And just one final point point I'd like to make about him. There's a video of him on YouTube visiting Baghdad and speaking before Saddam Hussein and praising him. So this is certainly not a liberal. There are no liberal options in this race, and clearly the most threatening candidates, at least to Western interests, are the Islamists because of their hostile foreign policy views.
Shahira, bouncing off of that, some of the people would argue that the liberals, some of the young revolutionaries, the leftist forces in this election, they, what we would say, shot themselves in the foot because they have opposed very fiercely Islamist candidates. And by doing so, they perhaps are going to lead to a radicalization of the Islamist candidates. Do you see any?
I agree with the fact that we have no liberal candidates. And this perhaps explains again the point of view of the Copts, or the confusion in which they felt they were totally stranded a year after the revolution. There is no liberal candidate.
There are some
even
liberal...
Mohammed al-Baradei was not able to
and yet
to present himself.
Yet Abdel Foutou, one of the candidates we mentioned, the former Muslim Brotherhood candidate, he's been endorsed, he's been backed by both the liberals and by the Salafists, the most conservative group of Islamists.
Yes, at one stage he would have been credible, but in the meantime, unfortunately, he went for the votes of the Salafists. And this is a very big handicap for the Copts.
And Bernard, do you see any validity in people's arguments when they say, the Islamists, it's easy to exaggerate. When they come to power, power will moderate them. And in fact, these people will face the realities of Egypt like anyone else, and they're not going to be able to make Sharia law the law of the land. They'll have to be more moderate.
I think so, in as much as, Egypt faces the most dire economic consequences.
And we'll be talking about that
right,
in a second.
If it doesn't get its act together, it needs tourism. It needs foreign direct investment. And if anyone who comes to power adopts a strict Sharia interpretation of the law, the tourists won't come and the foreign direct investments won't come. So they will have to accommodate, that situation. Now, having said that, I don't think any candidate will be pro-Western, because the population of Egypt is not pro-Western, maybe with the exception of the Copts. But a vast majority of Egyptians are viscerally anti-Israeli and viscerally anti-American.
And I just want to bring that back to Eric Traeger. Eric, in the briefly, little time we have left in this half, you have said, you've been on the record as saying that you fear sort of the outcome of this election might be more radical ideologies, more political instability. Do you still see that as definitely happening, even with someone like Foutou, who has the backing of some more liberal forces?
Again, I want to correct you. Abdel Foutou is not backed by liberals. He's backed by youths who are active in Tahrir Square and are anti-regime. And they're happy to replace that regime with someone who, yes, could be more liberal, or with an Islamist. They're sort of indifferent. Many of them rallied around the Salafist candidate before he was forced to withdraw. So I would not call them liberals. I would call them anti-military and anti-Mubarak in the earlier stage. The reason why there will be ongoing political instability is because this new president's powers have not been defined by a constitution. So they're electing a president who will essentially be forced to struggle against the military and against the Islamist-dominated parliament for power. And that struggle is going to continue for a very long time. So that's really the danger in electing first a parliament and now a president without a constitution. And it's frankly a bed that the Muslim Brotherhood and the Salafists made when they endorsed a temporary constitution last year.
Eric, I'm going to have to cut you off there because we do have to go now take a short break. To our viewers, don't go away. We will be right back after the news for the second part of our debate on Egypt's presidential election.
Join us in Belgrade, the capital of Serbia, where key parliamentary and presidential elections were held earlier this month. We'll look at the results and we'll ask what they mean for Serbia's European future. We'll also tell you why a Serbian comedy is changing stereotypes about the country's gay community. And we'll meet Merjan Bajic, he's a sculptor, and he will guide us through the streets of Belgrade.
Don't miss Europe District, Saturday 1:10 p.m. Paris time on France 24.